let's have a look, because you're talking about tax. And I'm not going to play the story for you, but you were talking on News Hub this morning with some young politician called David Seymour. I think he's French. I haven't met him yet. We'll have to see what he does.
French Canadian, isn't it?
I think so. Oh, he's Canadian. That's right. He's Canadian.
Oh,
he
yes.
does that accent real well. And you talked about there being $1 billion because of their money that they're giving back to landlords through tax breaks, tax cuts, and reimbursing interest. News Hub tonight has reported that they've looked at the books and they've had it approved that it's $800 million out of the budgeted amount that National and ACT said this would cost. So they're out by nearly $1 billion, as it's saying on News Hub tonight. I just want to throw you the ball and let you speak to that, because what we see as the Jimmy Nobodies who don't know anything, who aren't journalists at all, is we see a bunch of promises made by this government, and just, whether it's the international tax on house sales falling over, or all these things that they said, yes, our numbers are good, we've done it, and we've got fat in there in case something goes wrong, just falling over and falling over and falling over, yet they still seem to be able to afford their tax cuts. And we're wondering why and how, and would love you to speak to that.
Yeah. So, I mean, firstly, good on News Hub for breaking this news. I just also want to reflect on the fact that I'm utterly devastated for the loss of that channel and a lot of the journalists in that space. Like, love them or hate them. And I know that all journalists and all different platforms get a lot of hate mail, much like politicians do. The diversity of voices and platforms is incredibly important for democratic accountability and for the function of our society. A functional, flourishing fourth estate is necessary to hold politicians to account. So I'm really worried about what's going to happen with the kind of, removal of some of those journos, and also what's happening at TVNZ and the cuts at Renews as well. So I'm really hoping, and this is just the final point on this, that Melissa Lee, who's the Minister of Broadcasting, actually tries to reach a cross-partisan agreement on this, because the last thing that we need is for all the more kind of overt and explicit politicization of public interest journalism funding. It's just fundamental for our democracy to work and for faith and trust in our institutions. So to the point around kind of their forecasts, look, the numbers were always made up, and you had, renowned economists like Craig Rennie, who was also in that story tonight from the CTU, who was making it abundantly clear that it was cookery. And it was just wild seeing, the now Prime Minister throughout the campaign saying everything was watertight, everything was watertight. That's the leader of the same National Party who opposed the Green Party's proposal to establish an independent parliamentary budget costings unit, which would cost all political parties election promises, such that we had a kind of baseline agreement about how things worked, and we could therefore have a more evidence-based debate and discussion, God forbid, during our general elections. So, it's evident that blowout was always going to happen in some way or another. The second thing is I'd make the point around choices. As you just kind of alluded to, Pat, this is now forecasted to be a $2.9 billion policy to implement over the next 4 years. That is $2.9 billion that is not going to be spent on other things like the crumbling public infrastructure around us. I was also on AM talking about the Pink concert and the fact that, folks were not able to get functional public transport in and out of that. It's frankly embarrassing. We call ourselves a world-class city. This is, where a third of the population live, and we can't properly invest in getting people around it. It costs us billions of dollars in productivity costs, if you're solely to look at it from a right-wing kind of perspective, not to mention the healthcare and mental health kind of impacts of that kind of stuff. And then the climate and environmental ones too. So at that point around choices, this government is making an explicit choice to hand over, during what they are calling a cost of living crisis, $2.9 billion to those who evidently sit at the kind of further to the top end of town, those who own assets and are able to rent them out and to borrow against them and otherwise. The argument that I've also heard made around how this is somehow going to be passed on to renters is just economic ridiculousness. And you'll get tons of independent economists that can say this, but, Shimabeel Yaqub is a good one to kind of look to on this, who has made the point that, we're not looking at pass-through costs here. At a point in time when we had a few years ago prior to COVID-19 among, historically low mortgage rates, we didn't see that passed along to renters. We then had historically historically high rental costs as well. So the only way that we are going to meaningfully be able to get rents down is either obviously through kind of the classical market economics ways of getting more supply on stream, but also through policies that have worked massively overseas, the likes of rent controls, which we already have in some form through the Residential Tenancies Act, which prescribe that you can't raise rents more than market rate. The problem is that that's a self-fulfilling prophecy, because who sets market rate but the landlords? And just the final point around the kind of choices, right, is, you know, I have sat through that kind of, as I was talking about, just this Orwellian nonsense in Parliament, as is all of our amazing new Green team, our largest ever Green Party caucus over the last few months, is this government's just rammed through things without adequate public scrutiny or input, and just complete disregard for the usual conventions and protocols, and said that the reason that they're doing that is because they won the election, so apparently we can just revert to authoritarian rule as a result of that. But they also didn't campaign on things like reversing the smoke-free generation policies, which, mean demonstrably, again, and their evidence shows, is going to result in more people smoking for longer, and therefore more people dying, because this is a product which kills half of its consumers. That will give them a revenue boost of approximately $500 million per year. The trade-off there is more New Zealanders dying so that the government can have $500 million, which helps to pay for things like their tax cuts for landlords. They also are doing things like seeking to steal school kids' lunch money. They also have cut $1 billion from walking and cycling and public transport. Like, the list goes on. And we are just, I think, in this really bizarre situation where we're 40 years on now in 2024 from 1994, yet all of this, 1984 rather, where all of this is just straight from the Rogernomics playbook. We're back in a trickle-down kind of war is peace world, but we have 40 years of evidence to show that it doesn't work.